All right, Don Bentley, welcome to the Dad Edge podcast, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me, Larry.
Thanks for coming on. It's rare that I get to talk to somebody who has such a diverse background as far as the things that you've experienced, the things that you've done. And what I would love for you to do is just take us take us back, several years ago,
Sure.
to where you started in this journey that you've been on for several years now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's kind of cool, but when my wife introduces me to people, she says that I could never figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And that is probably also somewhat true. So I went to college at the Ohio State University on an Army ROTC scholarship. And
Nice.
so that means that I got to go on active duty for 10 years after that. And specifically, I got to fly Apache gunship helicopters, which is a pretty awesome freaking job. On most days, it's hard to imagine that they actually pay you to fly Apache helicopters. I felt like I should be paying them. But as part of that 10-year service, I deployed to Afghanistan from 2005 to 2006 as an Army Air Cavalry Troop Commander. And then when I got out of the Army back in 2007, I went to kind of a corporate America job, which was fantastic. My wife and I are high sweethearts. All of our family live back in Ohio. And so I did that for 3 years, but I wasn't quite ready to sit in a cubicle just yet. And so the FBI at the time was very heavily recruiting folks from the military, and specifically folks with combat experience. And so I went into the FBI for a couple of years and had a great time, and was a special agent in charge of running and recruiting what we call sources, and what folks in the intelligence community call assets. And it was a fantastic job. And at the same time, I was fortunate enough to make the SWAT team. And so I had a lot of fun doing that. But then I went and left the FBI. I had a couple of friends from the military who formed a small company, and we helped folks who wanted to market and develop technology for Special Operations Command. And so all of my coworkers were either former Rangers or former Green Berets. And I think we even had a SEAL, because we had to hire a SEAL. That was one of the requirements. That's not true, but he's a good guy as well. And I've spent the last 8 years working in similar roles for different companies. And at the same time, I was always in the background writing. And so I kind of got serious about writing back in 2000. I wrote 3 books, which didn't sell. And then finally wrote my 4th book, which was called Without Sanction, my debut novel, that sold in a 2-book deal. And am now working on the 4th book in that, which is called Hostile Intent, and comes out next Tuesday, and talks about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Who could have imagined such a thing? And at the same time, I also get to write the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan Jr. series. So my 2nd book in that series, that's called 0 Hour, comes out in June. So it's been a pretty crazy life, and it's pretty neat now, but man, I would have never imagined it when I was 14 years old and reading my first Tom Clancy book, that one day I'd get to write Tom Clancy books. So it has been pretty cool.
That is absolutely surreal and serendipitous at the same time. That is quite a journey. I've actually, I don't know if you know Chris Voss or if you know him personally.
The
Um,
name sounds really familiar, but I can't recall off the top of my head.
so he was the chief hostage negotiator for the FBI for years.
Okay.
Wrote the book Never Split the Difference.
Mm.
So yeah, we your background is fascinating. And by the way, go Buckeyes. My boys, and I have 4 boys, but
Okay.
my 2 older ones are 16 and 14. And believe it or not, I've never been to a college football game. I mean, I've watched them on TV, but
Wow.
never been to one. I went to college. I went to Southeast Missouri State, but not
Yeah.
nearly
Yeah.
on the level of these D1 schools.
Yep.
And so my 16-year-old, he's a band kid, so he plays
Hmm.
on the high school marching band and that kind of thing, and he loves the Ohio State marching band.
Yeah.
And then my 14-year-old has been playing football for the past 5 years and has no intention of ever stopping. And his first year of high school is next year, so he loves Ohio State football. So I was like, you know
Nice.
what? I was like, let's take a trip. Let's go see. Let's.
Oh, awesome.
I've never seen a big college football game, and
Yep.
I know Ohio really well. Like, let's go out there. We did, and back in November this past year, and we had an absolute blast, and they beat the snot out of Michigan State when we were up there. Like it was after a while, we're like, wow, do we even stay? Like it was like 56-7 or something like that. So
That's awesome.
that's super cool, man. Well, also, obviously what you're doing professionally is super, is really, really cool. But I also tell us about your family and what that looks like.
Yeah, so I met my wife when she was 16 and I was 17. We actually met in church youth group. And so started dating when I was a senior in high school and she was a junior. And we dated all through college and got married as soon as we graduated. We've been married 25 years. And so we have 3 kids together. So my oldest is a sophomore at Texas A&M and he's in the Corps Cadets. And Ohio State has amazing football, and watching a game there is pretty incredible. But we went and saw, because the Corps Cadets at Texas A&M actually marches in for the home games and everything. And so we went to go see him march in, and I have never been to a football game like that before. Like just the raw intensity of the crowd. The kids have this incredible tradition about being the 12th man, so they stand the entire time during the game, and it was unbelievable. And so he hates them because he has to wear his Corps Cadets uniform and bake in the Texas sun during the entire time. But it was a pretty amazing experience. And then I have 2 daughters, one who is a senior in high school, and then one who's a freshman in high school. And so the senior in high school is very much wants to be a writer as well. And so when she was younger, we used to go on little daddy-daughter writing dates together. And so she'd work on something and I'd work on something. Then we kind of compare notes and stuff with it. Now she doesn't want dad's input so much on what she's writing, which is fine. But she's a super smart girl, and she's going to go to University of Arkansas next year and major in mechanical engineering. And then my youngest daughter is a freshman in high school, and you can hear her always before you see her. She's always singing. She's always doing something crazy. And she is my gym buddy. She's super into fitness and lifting weights and stuff like that. So we actually go to the gym together, which is funny. I think like a lot of dads maybe, or dads of boys, I grew up with brothers, or with a brother, never had any sisters, and thought I only wanted boys, and was super happy when I had my firstborn was a son. And then I had a daughter and realized everything I was missing. And so it's pretty incredible to have both girls and boys. But with 4 boys of your own, I can't even imagine what your grocery bill must be. You must have 3 or 4 jobs just to pay for the amount of milk that gets drank at your house on a weekly basis.
You'd probably pass out if I told you what we average. Like it's funny you mention that. I have a follow-up question about what you said, but let me first talk about that. My wife and I joke about it, that the one room it's not even a room, but the one place that we are always, if we could put bets on when we're going to find at least one of the kids, that's in the pantry.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're constantly eating, and when they eat something, right after they eat something, they want something else to eat, and then after that, they're still hungry and they want something else to eat, and it is we can't keep up, like we really can't. And a lot of people, they ask, they're like, "What's it like raising 4 boys?" And my description has never changed or faltered, and it's like, just imagine being in college and being in a fraternity party that you never leave. That's what it's like. But you said something there that's really, really, it piqued my curiosity, and I'm going to butcher the way you said it, but I think I can take the theme from it, is that you didn't really know what you missed growing up with a brother, then having a son, but there's something that you've realized that has been super special about having a girl. Can you just tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it started, like I said, my oldest daughter, it started probably when she was 3 or 4, and she figured out pretty quick that if she wanted something, she could crawl up into dad's lap and ask, and whatever it is, I would give it, to the point where my wife is like, she has you wrapped around her finger right now. You cannot. And I'm like, I can't tell this no. Like, I don't know. My son is like, no. And for her, I'm like, yeah, it's okay. You can. And so, it's just a completely different dynamic between fathers and daughters. I remember us being kids, or her being a little bit older than that. And there was one Sarah Evans album that she loved and would listen to nonstop. And we would dance in the living room to it. And she would stand on my feet as we danced to the song. from Sarah Evans. And so it's just like a different dynamic. She's super, Faith is her name, and she's super into music and stuff too. And so when we would, there was a time when we'd go to church as a family, and for whatever reason, she and I would leave late, and they had special on the radio called, Acoustic Sunrise or something. So we talk about music and stuff as we're driving to church. And then flash forward, 10 years later, and she and I are driving to go visit the University of Arkansas. And I'm like, you're the DJ on this trip. And so she knows I'm crazy about all kinds of bad 80s music. And so she would take all of that and then take her newer alternative music that had its roots drawn from that older stuff and mix that up in the whole thing. And so, I love having a boy, but it's completely different when you have girls. The things that you or how you relate to them, the way you talk about the things you talk about, it's just completely different, and it's awesome. And then, like I said, I just feel so blessed to have both boys and girls.
Wow, man, that, it's funny. My wife and I, my wife has two brothers. One of them is married. They also have 4 kids, and they have 2 daughters, so 2 boys, 2 girls. And it's really crazy because the youngest one, she's 5, and she'll just like come up and sit on my lap and like kind of like slap my cheeks and then just like look at me, and I'm like, and my boys will do that, right? And but like I hit them back, you know what I mean? Like wrestle, like, man, come on, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I find with a girl that it's like endearing, and I'm like, oh, you're so cute. You slap me in the face, you know what I mean? It's just like it's a total. And my wife just like, she'll see that and she'll like laugh, and she's like, oh my God, like, you would be a total pushover with a girl. I'm like, you're right. There's probably a really big reason why I only have boys, because like the girl would probably get away with murder all the time. So
that's true. And I think the other part though too, what surprised me, again, kind of stereotypical, maybe image of girls or growing up without having any girls, is how fierce the 2 girls are too. And so for a while we had all 3 kids in jiu-jitsu, and the 2 girls loved it and were pretty good with everybody else until they were paired together. And when they were paired together, it was like blood sport or something. And so I picked them up once, and the littler one, I think this is probably, they were maybe, 6th and 3rd grade or something like that. The 3rd grader came dancing out, and I was like, what happened? And she's like, I got Faith, the older one, in mount. And Faith was like, it was for 10 seconds. And the younger one's like, best 10 seconds of my life. And it was, it's funny to see still how competitive they are, and how, still fierce they are, but then having, like I said, completely different than boys, and the way you interact with them is completely different. It's magical. It really is.
that is so cool, man. It's funny you talk about jujitsu. I've had this background in martial arts. I've done a few different martial arts over the past 20 years, and I've taken a break from it. The last martial art I did with my oldest son, which was Krav Maga. We did that for a year together. He was kind of going through this phase where he was getting bullied at school and that kind of thing. He was always on the smaller side. So I was like, hey, he's like, let's go do Taekwondo. I was like, why don't we go do one that's effective? Not to offend anybody who does Taekwondo. I was like, but it can't be effective.
Let's call a spade here.
Right. I was like, but let's go train with a super effective martial art, like one that like will teach you all different aspects of like some grappling and striking and all this stuff. And they'll put you in real world situations. I'll never forget, we were in class one time, and they're like, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to teach you guys, if you get cornered by 4 people in the corner, how to basically get out of that situation. I was like, oh my God. I took Taekwondo for years, and I was like, man, we never learned this stuff in Taekwondo. But it's funny you talk about jujitsu, because one of the things that we pride ourselves on in the family, and we always encourage our guys who listen to, is, you have the right to to know how to defend yourself and the people that you love. And in order to do that, you have to learn it. So like this summer, the one martial art I've never done is jujitsu. And so me and my 2 oldest, we're gonna take some jujitsu together this summer. So we're excited about that. I want to switch gears a little bit just to marriage. Now you've known your wife for how many years total now?
Let's see. It would have been 30, 31.
31 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So 31 years, 3 kids. You've had dad experience now for 20 years. You've had relationship experience with your wife for over 30 years. What are some key lessons? Like if you could go back and
Yeah.
have a conversation, take yourself out to dinner 30 years ago, like you are who you are now. And then you have an opportunity, you call yourself on the phone, 30 years ago, and you're like, hey man, I want to take you out to dinner for an hour. This is me from the future, 30 years from now. And I want to give you some really good advice on what to expect and what you're going to learn, and maybe how to mitigate some of the things that you're going to fall short on. And so you take yourself out to dinner, you sit down with yourself. What would you tell yourself?
So I think before I get to that, I think one of the things that helped us was the fact that we went to separate colleges and dated for 6 years. And so there were a lot of things we figured out prior to marriage that we didn't have to figure out during the first year of marriage, whether that was how we were going to manage expectations of two different families, whether it was, kind of when we wanted kids or what, or how are we were going to fight when we had to fight. A lot of those things, because our relationship had so long to develop, was easier for us. And that really paid dividends, because my first assignment out of flight school was South Korea, and my wife was able to come with me, but we're like far away from all of our family. It was just us, and you're removed from that. And that's another great like incubator for that time in marriage, because there were other times that were certainly much harder when I was deployed to Afghanistan for a year, when I was working crazy hours as an FBI agent. And there's that ebb and flow in every marriage. And I think that having that foundation allows you to help navigate that ebb and flow. I think being more specific to what I would have told myself. So one of the inflection points in our marriage was about 8 years ago, I think, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And so the small company that I'd left the FBI to go work at ended up having a pretty dramatic downsizing, and most of us were laid off for it. And so for 6 months, I was laid off, and it was the hardest 6 months of my life. Like, I'd rather do Afghanistan again than be laid off for 6 months, because you never know when it's going to end. You never know, at points you're in the first month, I was like, I have an engineering degree. I have all this great experience. I'll be out of work for a week. And it just kept going and going. And at some point you're like, I don't know if this is ever going to end, and I'm ever going to be able to take care of my family again. And it was just a pretty horrific time on one hand. On the other hand, it taught me a lot, and it taught us a lot. And so we had growing up, or up until that point, my wife is a teacher, and she stayed home when the kids were little. And we very much had a traditional, I did stuff out of the house, she did stuff in the house, and that's how we balanced it out. Well, about the time I got laid off, she went back to work, and it was very much a role reversal. And for me, it was like, holy cow, like this is all the stuff that she's been doing in addition to working. And, whether it was, making dinners, taking care of the kids, folding laundry, doing the stuff. And I haven't been doing any of that. And it was, it really just blindsided me about how much I was taking advantage of her and how much she was giving that I didn't appreciate or didn't acknowledge, or frankly just expected. And so that was part of it. Another part of it, she for the first time had a life outside of the house and was doing something that she loved and still loves. She does it to this day. She has a reading or a minor in reading recovery, and is now dyslexia certified. And she works with kids in small groups that are struggling with reading and just loves it. And I remember, at one point, I can't remember what we were talking about, but I was like, what if we have to, move or or do something? And at one point she looked at me and she's like, what if our life isn't all about you? And for a minute, I'm like, well, of course it is. And it really, really took back. And I was like, like there's somebody else here who, because it's really easy to do, especially in the Army, where you don't have a choice and somebody has to follow and somebody has to get moved around by the Army's diktat. And so you don't really think about what the other person wants to do, or the other person. And so I think that there are, I think in marriages in general, it's really, really hard for two people to have a career. And what I mean by that is usually one person needs to have a job and one person has a career. But if both people are pursuing a career at the same time, it gets really hard to do sacrifice and kind of ebb and flow. And that can change from one person to other. There can be a season where, hey, I'm going to focus on my career and do this, and you're going to have a job for a while, and then we're going to switch back and forth. But I think so much of marriage, or marriages have done well, is when you spend more time thinking about, holy cow, this is everything the other person is doing for us and the family, and I need to up my game, or I need to outserve them, or I need to do more to match, versus the mindset of thinking that this is a halfway thing, and I'm going to saw off my half of it and focus on that and only do the things that are in my little bucket of it. And it was, like I said, it was probably the hardest 6 months of my life, but one of the most rewarding, I think, from a marriage and family perspective, looking back.
Wow. It's that's listen, I've recorded almost 1,000 of these podcasts over the past 7 years. And, number one, I didn't expect that, right? Because like here I see like this incredible career, like all on this, like all I see is massive success, right? When I look at you and your bio,
Sure.
and the things you're doing and the things you're done and the things you're going to continue to do. And then to hear like, there was this period, right? There was this season, there was this half of year in your life that there was tremendous uncertainty, and there was a tremendous, maybe even slap in the face of reality.
Absolutely.
And the other thing too is there was tremendous honor and appreciation that you saw your wife through all over again, because you were in that season, and you had to pick up the slack at home, and you're like, oh my God, she's been doing all these things, and I didn't even really realize it. How is that experience? How did that change the trajectory of your relationship after that?
I think it did a couple of things. Like it really was, parts of it felt like a sitcom or something, because of the amount of role reversal, where she's now succeeding in her job and staying late at work. And I'm like, I just tried this new recipe and you're not here for it. And I'm like, what is happening right now? Like, what are these words that are coming out of my mouth? But I think it made everything after that, number one, more appreciative for what she does. And number two, I think a lot of mamas carry the family on their shoulders. They just do. And they do it. I don't know why. They just do it. They're programmed to do it. They just do it. And I think that had it not been for that 6 months, it probably would have stayed that way. And so now though, when I think about, hey, she's getting up at 5 a.m. because it's her time to make dinner, and she's, browning the meat and doing this other thing before she even leaves for work. What can I do to help her out, even though that it's not my turn, or it's not? And I think that's what I think it takes you. I've got 3 teenage kids, one that's almost, he's 20. So I guess maybe he's not a teenager, but he still acts like it. And the thing that's crazy about teenagers, or kids in general, before they become adults, is that they take everything they see around them for granted. We all did, right? We all did. Never did I think, what were the sacrifices my parents were making to do X, Y, or Z for me? What were the things that were happening behind the scenes for me so that I could go to college? What were the things that were keeping them up at night that they completely shielded from us, right? And I think you can do that same thing with your marriage. And I think I certainly was. Like I had had jobs that were very easy to wrap yourself in the flag with, for lack of a better term. So in the Army, there was very little flexibility. And, when we first had little kids, I was a pilot and we flew at night. And so I wasn't there for changings, or I'm like, I got to get crew rest. I can't do it this time. Or even when I was an FBI agent, when you're a new agent, you're trying to prove yourself. And so I'm volunteering for everything that I can do. And there'd be more than one time when I thought I'm coming home for the day and somebody needs help with a surveillance operation or somebody. And it's super, super easy to take that and justify how much you're taking away from your family and giving to your job. And I have, we're both devout Christians. I have a lot of friends who are in ministry, and the conversation I have with people, the church we go to right now is a very young church. Most of them are in their early 30s. And the conversation I have with the folks who are in ministry is, you have to remember that that is just a job. Like, it is a noble job. What you're doing is important, but at the end of the day, it is still just a job. And when you look at your priority things, it needs to be your relationship with Christ, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your family, and then your job. And when you have jobs that are super important, or you can talk yourself into how important they are, it's so easy to steal from your family. It's so easy to steal from the relationship with your spouse. And you have to guard that. And I've been, by the grace of God, there've been a couple of times like that were wake up calls for me, but I've also seen friends whose marriages disintegrate. And it seems to happen right around the 10-year mark, right about the middle of 30s. You just watch relationships disintegrate. And one of my great friends, who's a pastor as well, and he said, nobody ever stands across the altar from each other on their wedding day and thinks, I'm going to divorce this person 10 years from now. We're going to be the people. Nobody ever thinks that, but somehow that happens. And I think a lot of the ways that it happens is that when you get in the point where you're making calls and you're giving up one piece in order to get another, it isn't temporary, even though you think it is. And it becomes the status quo. It became the status quo that, because in the Army, we didn't have much of a choice, that every role after that, my wife more than picked up her share of the responsibility. And we just come to accept that. And it was taking things away from our relationship in order to do that. And so I think, conversely, when I got book deal and then got offered the Tom Clancy book deal, I wasn't in a place yet where I could write full time. And so I was going to turn that deal down, because I said, there's no way I can write, because what it basically meant is I'm writing 2 books a year and I still have a full-time job, because the money wasn't there to be able to do it. And so I told my wife about it, and I was like, I'm going to turn it down. And she's like, you can't turn it down. Like, this is the thing you wanted to do forever. And I was like, there is no way I can do this because I had a very demanding job. I was an executive at a startup company at the same time. And she's like, all right, we're going to call a family meeting. And so, the kids come in and they hear about it. And they're like, yeah, Dad, of course I do it. And I'm like, you say that, but let's talk about what that actually means. And so what we did is come up with, here's a time period. So for the next 6 months, we're going to try and do this, and we're going to see how it works, and understand that Dad's going to be busy on Saturdays and maybe part of Sundays and stuff like that. But it is for this period of time. Everybody gets to cry uncle if they want. Anybody can cry uncle, and we'll reassess it at the end of 6 months. And I was the one who actually cried uncle first. And I'm like, I can't keep doing both of these things. And ended up being an answer to prayer that I got to write an extra book. And so with that, I could then transition full-time writing. But I think that is the more sustainable way, is that you have to say, for a season, this is what we're going to do. But the person that you're making that deal with, your spouse, your kids, it also has to be part of it that you can't come to me when the tank's completely empty and you say, you got to quit tomorrow. Like, what are the ways, what are the things, the escape valves that we're going to use so that I can start to see that it's getting too heavy for you, that it's coming off the tracks, and we can plan ahead and mitigate that, as opposed to, a Sunday morning you wake up and your spouse says, you can't do this job anymore because I'm about to lose it. And so to me, that was part of the give and take, is, okay, if we're going to do this, and if I'm going to be willing to work it this hard and still have it, you have to be honest with me about where you are, and about where you are with the amount of time away. I'm not. And I think you can navigate those things well in a marriage with those conditions set around them.
You know what is incredible about everything you just said is the theme is being very clear with your communication on both sides.
Yep.
And not only, here's the other really cool thing. I don't know if, and I'm sure you probably already know this, or if anybody else has ever pointed this out. I think it's incredible that you incorporated the entire family in that decision, in what to
Yeah.
expect. Here's how it's going to change. Here's how it's going to play out. And here's the maybe even the length of time it's going to last. And we're just going to see how this goes. Is everybody on board with this? Like, I think that's a really cool thing, because when somebody in the family, and sometimes it's even the kids, right? But sometimes
Hmm.
when one person in the family, especially if they're in a highly triggered emotional state, right? And let's
Hmm.
call it, like, it could be a layoff, it could
Yep.
be anything,
Yep.
right? And then suddenly it's like, I don't know what I need to do. I just need to go do something. And then you go do that thing,
Yep.
right? And you don't
Yep.
inform the other people. You don't necessarily, communicate it very well. You just go do it. And people are like, what direction are you going in? Why are you doing this? And there's
Yeah.
a huge impact that we're feeling because you're doing this. We don't even know if it's going to work out. We're not on board. And I
Yep.
think it's incredible that your communication, and I'm guessing one of the areas you learned clear communication, was it in the military?
Yeah, I think it was, in the military for sure. But again, my wife and I, when we dated, especially through college, we had a long distance relationship through 5 years, 5 years of going to
Wow.
different colleges, 5 years of sometimes only seeing each other once a month or and things like that. And so you have to learn that very specific communication. And frankly, and I think we've gotten better at it the longer we've been married, because the worst thing that you do, and it's unintentional, is that we all, when we don't hear something clearly from someone else, what we often do is project what we would feel or what we would say in their situation, right? And they didn't say this, but surely this is what they mean. And so then when it doesn't turn out that way, you feel betrayed, or you feel like that person didn't live up to their end of the bargain, and the other person's like, what are you even talking about? Like, I never said that, we never voiced that agreement, and so it's, i think I think a lot of that a lot of it is just having those clear expectations, and saying, when you say this, here's what I think that means. Is that what you actually mean? Because otherwise, like I said, it's the best of intentions, and you're even, assuming the best about the other person, but they're a different person, and they look at things completely different than you. And that's where I think the friction comes in a lot of times, is that there are assumptions that are made based on, well, I know him, I've been married to him for 25 years, this is what they mean, versus what they actually said. And a lot of times those can be two different things.
I completely agree with that, especially if you've been married for a long time, or even, even if it's not even in
Mm-hmm.
double digit years yet, that
Yeah.
you label your spouse because you think that you view them through this lens of labeling, right? Well, this is how
Yep.
they are, so this is what they mean.
Yep.
And the cool thing that you just said is that getting the clarity. Hey, I heard you
Mm-hmm.
say this. This is the way I took it. Is that the way you meant it? What a lot
Yep.
of couples will do is they'll take that, whatever they said, oh, they meant that. And
Yep.
then they'll
Yep.
they'll never get the clarity. And then they'll be internally just pissed off and hurt and then resentful. And then
Yep.
what happens is, sometimes we will withhold affection, we'll
Mm-hmm.
withhold communication, we'll hold this grudge, and then all of a sudden there's tension.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's tension in the air. And then suddenly, like, there's this build of emotional resentment. And emotional
Mm-hmm.
resentment is the birth of the end of a relationship that could possibly come if you don't head that off. So I think that's incredible that you be bold, right? Hey, this is
Yeah.
what I heard you say. This is the way I took it. Is that the way you meant it? I just would really like some clarity. And then
Yeah.
you can scrap it. You can put it behind you, which I think
Yep.
is a great skill to have, and a great communication skill to have. This is awesome. I want to segue over to your latest book. And it's funny on this podcast. I don't talk politics,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't talk things like this, but I'm very fascinated because you have been working on this book for how long?
Yeah. Usually, so I finished it in I turned it in July of 2021.
Oh
So
my gosh.
about, yeah,
So are you
about a
like
year ago.
are you clairvoyant or something?
No, I think so. One of the things, so a couple things. I knew my first two books. So let me go back a little bit and tell you about my book. So my editor is incredible. His name's Tom Colgan, and he's edited everybody from Tom Clancy when he was still alive, the Janet Ivanovich, the Lee Child. So some really big heavy hitters in fiction. And so when I came with my debut novel, he said, when you're breaking into fiction, into genre fiction, what you want to do is the same but different. And what he meant is that, Lee Child writes a great Lee Child book. I'm never going to write, the same style of book that he can write, but I need to have a book that fits in that genre, but is still offers something different than what's out there. And so I made some very distinct choices in my book and in my protagonist. I write kind of a witty first-person protagonist, much like Nelson DeMille's iconic John Corey character, because when I looked around there were a lot of folks who were writing excellent, really serious guys. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to write somebody who's kind of like me, that spends most of his time making fun of himself. And I'm going to do that different. I'm going to, my protagonist is a guy that works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is an agency I learned about kind of in my past life, but I hadn't heard a lot about. And I thought, here's another choice that I'm going to do different. And so when it came to my third book, For Hostile Intent, my first two books had very much centered on Middle East topics. And I said, you know what? I'm going to shift to Europe because that hasn't been done for a while. And, my last assignment in the military was in Germany. We got to travel a whole lot. And so the book actually starts in Austria and Vienna. I got to visit there and run a marathon there. And it's a fantastic city, but it also has this intrigue about it because in addition to being the city music, Vienna is known as the city of spies because it's where East and West meet. And during the Cold War, you would have the Iron Curtain kind of went through there. And so you'd have folks on the East and West both vying for position. And there's this urban legend that on any day there are 7,000 spies roaming the streets of Vienna still. And I'm like, that's a fantastic city. And then I also wanted to do something that showed kind of a more epic European-centric war. And so I looked at some things that had gone on and obviously saw what Russia had done in Georgia and then in Ukraine, and then said, let me do that because that'll be really interesting to show as a writer. Hostile Intent is a bigger book. It shows the Russian invasion from a whole bunch of different points of view characters, everything from a Russian paratrooper to a Ukrainian girl to Ukrainian militia members. And I really wanted to show that. And so one of the things that the military teaches you, or the Army specifically, is there's a job at the battalion level that's called the S2, and that job is the intelligence officer. And so the intelligence officer's job when you're planning an operation is to say, here's the enemy's strength and disposition, here's where they're actually going to allocate their forces. And then before you go execute the mission, you actually have what's called a terrain board rehearsal. And so soldiers will go out there and create a mock of, so if you're in the mountains of Afghanistan and you're going to fly up and stack in this attack by fire position and shoot up these tanks as they're coming down a road, they will actually build this terrain model, and the commanders will go out and walk on it and say, okay, here I am with my 8 Apache helicopters. We're crossing this release point. Here's where we're going to array ourselves. And so the S2 during this plays the role of the enemy commander. And so he or she will come forward and say, okay, once I've seen that you've done that, I'm going to have my air defenses target these positions. And it's like a chess match that goes back and forth. And so that's very prevalent in all levels in the military. When you're a platoon leader, you learn to think that way because you are developing company level missions or troop level missions, and so you do this over and over again. And so for me, it was very easy to say, okay, if I'm the Russian commander who's staging an invasion in Ukraine, how would I go about doing that? What are the shaping operations I would use? And so once you kind of stumble on, or once you decide on what you want to show, having a military background, specifically an Army background, was very, very useful. And so that's where a lot of the things came from in the book. And some of the things I got right, what the Russians did, some of the things I got wrong. I'd say the biggest thing I missed, which I think the entire world missed, was the bravery and the ferocity of the Ukrainian people in resisting that invasion. When the Russians went into the Donbass much earlier and annexed parts of Crimea and such, they were basically able to do that the first time with very little effort on their part. They did, some incredible shaping operations where they had Spetsnaz folks go in and set the conditions to make it look like the Russians were, invited into Ukraine. And so I think everybody expected, or at least I expected, something very similar. And what I didn't take into account was the time between that invasion and now, where U.S. Special Operations troops have been in Ukraine training Ukrainian soldiers, and where, frankly, the Ukrainian people drew a line in the sand and said, this is not going to happen. We are not going to go quietly in the night. We're not going to give up our country without a fight. And we've seen that. And I think it's both inspired and shocked the Western world, because that is something, frankly, we haven't seen in quite a long time. When you look at some of the fights that are going on now, unfortunately, you saw, like when ISIS took over Iraq, large swaths of the Iraqi military deserting. You saw similar things, even though there are parts of the Afghan military that fought very valiantly against the Taliban. You also had large number of folks desert. And to see not just the military, but an entire people rise up to defend themselves, it really is, it really is both inspiring and also a little connecting as Western nations to say, man, look at what these people are willing to do on behalf of their country, and it's not all guys and girls with Javelin anti-tank missiles. I mean, I think one of the most iconic pictures is when you see at night this Russian column snaking through a Ukrainian city, and it looks like the middle of a meteor shower because there's so many Molotov cocktails that are coming out of windows. And you just think about that for a minute. That's somebody's grandma or mother or, guy that was an accountant yesterday, and today he's a bottle full of gasoline he's chucking at a Russian tank. I mean, the courage that takes and the ferocity is just mind blowing. And I think as a whole, the Western world, we're just like, wow, look at what these people are doing. It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, to say the least, it's been unbelievable to see some of the, excuse me, the bravery and the courage
Mm-hmm.
that has come from the Ukrainian people. And it blows my mind though that this is what your book is about, and it's just, I mean, you know, um, I can only imagine, how the book will probably fly off the shelf just because people are so aware of what's going on. I'll be real honest. This is the first time
Yeah,
I've ever had an author who's a fiction author on the podcast.
sure.
And I've never been able to ask a question like this, but I'm just so curious. Um, how do you want to impact the world in a positive
Yeah.
way through your stories?
So, my protagonist, like I said, is a guy named Matt Drake, and he's a former member of the Army Ranger Regiment. He was a company commander there, and he's a current case officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is his job is basically to run and recruit assets to find people who will spy against their government so that we can get answers to questions that we need. And so it's very similar in some ways to the job that I did in the FBI, though mine was obviously focused here in the continental United States, and he, like the CIA, focuses overseas. But as I was, again, doing this same but different, like my first two books that didn't sell had protagonists that probably could have been in any book, right? That were guys that kicked in doors and shot bad guys in the face and did what they did, but there was nothing really different about them. And so as I am in the military, in the FBI, and then specifically in the last 8 years where I've worked with folks primarily from the special operations and intelligence community, these guys really changed the way I looked at the world and specifically how it found its way into my writing. And so I'll give you examples. So as a former Ranger, Matt Drake, my protagonist in Hostile Intent, has something that's called the Ranger Creed. And this is something that every Ranger memorizes in Ranger school. If they're in the Ranger Regiment, they memorize it. And there's a portion of it that says something along the lines, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit. It says, "Never will I allow a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy." And so you and I hear that and you're like, yeah, I can get behind that. Sounds good. But to those people, it's not an HR statement. It's not a motto. It's a blood oath. It's something that they swear to each other when they go into combat. And the way that this was driven home to me was twofold. So one, one of my very close friends now that I started working with 9 years ago is a former member of the Army's Delta Force. And his very first operational assignment was Operation Gothic Serpent, which was in Somalia, which all of us know probably by the movie Black Hawk Down that was made of it. And so he was telling me about that awful day, and 2 different helicopters were shot down, and many of the crew members were killed. And he said, you know, when we were on that crash site recovering bodies, we were under fire. So the bad guys, the Somalis, are shooting at them as they're digging through the wreckage of this helicopter to pull bodies out for folks who are already dead. And so you think about that for a minute and you're like, why in the world would you risk the living for the dead? Like it doesn't make any sense. You know, why would you put men's life in jeopardy to recover bodies from people who are already dead? And reason is because they looked at each other and swore, never will I leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. And it meant so much to them that they were going to get onto that crash site and recover every forensic piece of their fallen comrade, even though they were doing it under fire. And when he said that, it just rocked me. And you know, it took me back to when I was in Afghanistan on June 28th, 2005. I was part of an operation that went tragically wrong, and a helicopter was shot down and a number of SEALs were killed as part of that. And the war in Afghanistan stopped from that moment until we recovered every single one of those fallen, because that's what we do as Americans. It's something that's unique to the American military. In fact, to this day, we are still repatriating people from the Korean War or World War II or Vietnam, you know, bringing them home, because when you stand in front of the sons and daughters who have been entrusted to you as a commander, you can say to them, I can't guarantee that you will come back alive, but I can guarantee that we will do everything we can to bring you back, because that's the promise that you make to each other. And so, you know, when he told me that, I was like, I have to provide a window for people who aren't lucky enough to know men like him into what their souls are like, what motivates them, what they think about, what are the people like who do those things that most of the time we don't even hear about. And when we do, we kind of, you know, ascribe them to superheroes who, you know, wear a cape and go do this incredible mission and then come back home. What are they really like? And so I've been lucky enough to find out what they've been really like. And when Without Sanction, my first book, came out, I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer said, "Are you Matt Drake?" And I said, "You know, I am absolutely not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the same room with him." And I honestly believe that. And so because I've been fortunate enough to have that vantage point, that's what I want people to see in my books is a window into that world.
Man, you've given me a whole new refreshing view on fiction. Because I got to be honest, man, I'm not a huge reader of fiction. I'm always fascinated by you know, the way I describe it is like the real history of something, or an actual person or an idea or strategy or whatever else. I've never ever thought about fiction the way you just described it, and I was like, that is fascinating, and it makes me very curious, you know, to dive into a book like you've written, because now that I know where it comes from, holy cow, man. Like, and, you know, now I'm like a raving fan. That's incredible. Because like I think a lot of people, you know, what we do is, you know, people look at fiction and they're like, oh, it's just somebody's imagination, right? But when you get to hear from a man's heart or an author's heart of why this book is important and why this book is meaningful and why this character is who he is or she is, it gives you so much more context to want to find out more about Matt Drake. So I think that this is so cool, man.
I think, sorry, just the double tap on that real quick. I think when one of my friends is Nick Petrie, and he's a fantastic writer. His first book is called The Drifter. And when my first couple books didn't sell, and I was talking to him about it, and he said, you know, what sets apart a good novel from a great novel is in a great novel, an author's trying to answer a question for themselves in the pages as they're writing. And so for me, for Without Sanction, it's very much a story of redemption. When the story begins, Matt Drake is in a very bad place because his asset in Syria was killed. His family, the asset's family, was murdered, and Matt's best friend, who's an African-American sniper from Delta Force named Frodo, was catastrophically injured, and Matt believes that it's his fault. And so what you're looking at is that when you have a moment in time where everything goes sideways and the job that you spent your entire life training to do doesn't go out, doesn't happen the way you want it, what do you do with your life after that? Like, how do you find meaning again? How do you find redemption? How do you find a sense of purpose? And that was my question. And so when I finally was brave enough to put it into that book, the book sold. With Hostile Intent, or actually with the book I'm working on now, which is the fourth book in my series called Forgotten War, it happens as Afghanistan's crumbling a year ago, because me and every other veteran, as we watched it happen, the question that kept coming to mind over and over again was it even worth it? Was what we did, was our sacrifice, was the friends that we lost there, was it even worth it? And so to me, that's what great novels do, is they give you that window. It's still a story. You're still reading to escape, but that gives you a window into something deeper, and it makes you think, and it makes you think about those questions. And so hopefully my books do that too.
Man, this is so cool, dude. Hey, so seriously, congratulations.
Thank you.
On one other thing I really want to applaud about you is your perseverance. So, we could have done the highlight reel on this podcast, right? Of all the amazing things that Don has done, and you have done amazing things, but you also gave us a glimpse into some suffering and some uncertainty that you had. And I think it's incredible. And I just celebrate with you the fact that you're this accomplished author, with massive book deals, and to come from a place where you're like, wow, I wrote a few books and nothing happened with them. And quite frankly, a lot of people would be like, well, that was cool. I guess I tried it and I'm just going to move on to something else. But you kept going. I was going to end the podcast here, but I do want to ask you one more question around perseverance.
Yeah.
Going back to that 6-month stint where there was a lot of uncertainty, going back to the time where you had a few books that just weren't selling.
Yeah.
What kept you going?
Yes, I think, and I'm gonna tie some of this back to being a veteran and transitioning. What that means is, so the short answer is community, and the way that I'll preface that is that when I left the Army, I had a lot of things stirring inside of me from that day in Afghanistan, from when you do something that you think is noble and is important, and so much of your own identity is tied up in that. And then you go from that to, again, I don't mean to disparage the company. It was a great company I was working in, but I'm sitting in a cubicle farm, and I'm in cubicles as far as the row can see, or I can see, and I'm in this row, and 6 rows to my right, I graduated from high school with that guy's daughter. So maybe in 20 years, I was thinking I could move from this row to that row, and that would be my life. And I thought, someday I'm going to pull into this parking lot and I will have been sitting in this cubicle for longer than I was flying an Apache. And then who am I even going to be at that point? I'm just going to be another dude sitting in a cubicle. And so I say that to say the people who understood that, and it could have tracked me through that, were fellow veterans. And I had inadvertently cut off all my contact with them because I had left the Army. I had left that community. I had left the people who understood me, who'd walked that path before, and was trying to navigate it all on my own. And I was failing at it pretty miserably. When I was unemployed, during that 6 months, the people who kept me going we had a life group at church. And this is, again, I'll get on a little bit of pedestal right now. The reason why you want to be involved in a life group is because everybody's life is going to have train wrecks, and those are the people who are going to come around you when it does. And if you wait until the point where you have a kid that's sick, you lost your job, you're going through a divorce, and then you try and find community, it's too late. and it's too late and you don't have that support group there. And the people who resonated the most with me at that time were people who had been unemployed and had walked through that and said, hey, here is how it's going to look for you. Here is going to, a good friend of mine, when I lost the job originally, he said, it's probably going to be about 9 or 10 months before you get a job. And I was like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I'll have a job in 2 weeks, and it took me 6 months. And so the same thing from a writing perspective, it was people who there's a tremendous writers conference for thriller writers called Thriller Fest. It's in New York. And it was started by like Lee Child and Heather Graham and Steve Barry, and all these luminaries came together. And I went there originally thinking it would help me from a craft perspective to be a better writer, to meet agents, to meet editors, and it helped with all of that. But what I really needed that I didn't know, and I talk about Nick Petrie again, he and I first met after the third book I'd written still didn't sell. And this is the book I went back to grad school. I got an M.F.A. in creative writing. This was my thesis novel. This is the one that I was going to make it, and nobody wanted it. And I was like, I don't even know if I should keep doing this. And so Nick and I met, and it was supposed to be like a 10-minute conversation. And an hour and a half later, it's like, I've got my head in his lap and I'm like, I'm never going to be a writer. And he grabbed me and he said, I wrote 3 books that didn't sell. Now I'm on my 2nd book deal. He's like, you're me 4 years ago. Go home and write your fourth book. And so it's really, I firmly believe our lives are not meant to be solitary endeavors, that we are meant to walk through this life in community, and the community that you surround yourself with are the people, the ones you will find most valuable are the ones who have been knocked around by life. That if you're going through cancer, the person you want to hear from is a cancer survivor. If you are going through a divorce, the person you want to hear from is a person who has been divorced and walked out on the other side of that. And I think that's true whether it's those big areas in our life or whether those are the little areas in our life in comparison, trying to find a success as a writer, trying to mitigate what it's like to transition from being a veteran to, a normal person. And that's why I think community is so, so important.
I couldn't agree more. And I love the fact that you have this theme around being proactive with finding that tribe and that community. We've had a mastermind for our dads now for almost 7 years called Dad Edge Alliance. That's the logo behind me. And we have hundreds of men who are a part of that group. And one of the things that I've learned just by watching other men in that group, including myself, is that you don't call the fire department when your house is engulfed in flames.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
At that point, it's just too late, probably. I mean, it's not too late, but there could have been a more proactive approach had you taken action earlier. We always say if you start to smell any type of burning, like when you turn on a light or you have a plug that gives you a slight spark, that's the time to call your electrician. That's the time to get your house inspected. And it's no different for community. And so I applaud that. I love that. And I love your mission. I want to make sure before we head out of here today, where is the best place for men to connect with you if they want more? If they want to obviously get copies of your books, where do they find you in that?
Yeah. So if you check out my website, it's donbentley.books.com. So DONBENTLEY books.com. I've got all the books and stuff there. You can find out more about them. It's got links to where to buy them. And it also has, you can sign up for my newsletter. And so I send out a newsletter about every month or so that talks about what I'm working on and what's coming up next. And you can also email me through there. I love hearing from readers. You can email me at donbentleybooks@gmail.com. Or if you're a Twitter or a Facebook person, my handle on both of those is @BentleyDonB. So @BENTLEYDONB. But I love connecting with readers. I'm so excited. Next week, I get to go out on book tour again, finally, after COVID shut everything down. So going to get to do that next week with Hostile Intent, which comes out on Tuesday. So it's fantastic. And I'd love to hear from people.
Oh, that's so cool, man. So you got to excuse my voice. I'm battling this, whatever it is. So I sound like I'm going through puberty as I close this show out. But hey, listen, guys in the audience, you won't have to look very far at all, okay, for everything that Don just listed out. We're going to make it very easy for you. All you have to do is go to thedadedge.com/374 for this particular show. This is the first time, as you guys know, in 7 years that I've had a fictional author on the podcast. But obviously, Don has come from a past of just an amazing success. And now that you know, obviously, where his books come from, straight from his heart and soul, and just the person that he is, please feel free to go support this man and his mission. And make sure you grab a copy of his books. I guarantee they will not disappoint. Again, just go to thedadedge.com/374. Don, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This was awesome. I really loved it.
Thank you so much for having me, Larry. It was fantastic.
You bet, brother. Gentlemen, as always, go out and live legendary. Take care.